Hey everyone, and welcome back to MOPA in Focus. Thanks for joining us today, wherever you might be tuning in from. I hope everybody's staying safe and healthy. We're going to give a couple minutes for everybody to go ahead and join us now that we're streaming live here from San Diego, California. In the meantime, while we wait for some folks to tune in, I want to make sure that all of you have a chance to go over to MOPA.org to check out all the latest information about the museum, as well as to take a look at some really cool online exhibitions that we have. We also have information about our current exhibitions at the museum, which we'll actually get to talk about today a little bit more in our program. And then you'll also find educational resources as well. So head on over to mopa.org and check out all that information. There's lots of great stuff for you to find there. So for today, for our MOPA in Focus, I wanted us to take a look at the camera obscura and pinhole photography. And today's program, every week on Fridays at 10 a.m., you can join us for MOPA in Focus. And really the spirit of the program is to take a look at works in MOPA's permanent collection inspired by artists who are currently on view at the museum. And right now we have a really cool exhibition up at the museum, even though we can't be there physically right now. And the name of the exhibition is Out of the Shadows, Contemporary Chinese Photography. And in that exhibition, we have the work of a couple different artists, 9 artists who are all living and working today and creating work. And I think what's really neat is that there are so many different kinds of approaches to photography that's represented in the exhibition. And the artist that we're going to be focusing on today, you can see an image by him. His name is Shi Guorui. And Shi Guorui uses these large camera obscuras. They're large enough for you to essentially enter into, kind of like a room, and we'll get into the connection there in just a second. And by placing photographic paper, black and white photographic paper, inside that camera obscura, it changes from an experience that you have just there in the moment. Lots of you may have checked out a camera obscura before. There's a couple really famous ones that are almost tourist attractions. I can think of one in the Bay Area here in California that's right on the water. And then, of course, hopefully you've had a chance to check out MOPA's camera obscura. It's a large camera obscura that it comes in many different pieces, and every now and then we like to take it out of the museum onto the Prado there in Balboa Park, and we like to set it up, and it takes a team of people because it literally does become a room. And it's really magical experience. There's something very particular about camera obscuras, and what I like to think of, they're sort of miniature cousin pinhole cameras. There's something really magical about it. It's magical because it's an experience for you to be in a space where you see this projected image of exactly what's going on outside. However, there's a few things that are a little bit different about it. For those of you who have probably had the experience of being in a camera obscura or seeing something similar to it, you'll notice the scene outside, when you look at it inside, is actually upside down and reverse. And that takes us right to the heart of how light travels, how reflected light travels. And it can teach us all sorts of things everywhere from the way our eyes see the world and focus light and render an image. And it really does take us to the fundamentals of photography, I like to think of. Nowadays where we have all of these different devices, you'll even see cameras behind me here. We have all these different devices, and modern technology doesn't really let us see sort of the inner workings, right? Those fundamental principles of photography. So things like a camera obscura, like a pinhole camera, those can really sort of show us a better understanding of what exactly is going on. How is it that when we tap our screen or when we press the shutter button, what happens in the time between that and the image that we end up seeing? it's also an opportunity to sort of really have this wonderful and unique experience. And I'm going to go ahead and actually show you an example of that today. You'll see some of the equipment that I have behind me here. And actually, this camera over here, I'm going to actually use that as sort of a little makeshift camera obscura, and give everybody an experience, if you haven't seen one before, give you a little bit of a feel for what that's like. So as I mentioned, today's program, we're going to be we're really going to be inspired by Shi Guorui's images, which are these large, large images. They're almost mural size, that he makes using a large camera obscura. But the wonderful thing is we can actually look back through time, through photographic history, using the collection of the museum. The collection of the museum has over 9,000 images now, since it started collecting in 1983. And it's such a wonderful thing because we can kind of take this one artist and see how is it connected across time, across geographic divides, across cultures. And I think there's something really beautiful about how it gives you this wonderful spectrum of all the different ways artists explore some of these fundamental principles, right? Some of these big ideas, like our big idea today with the camera obscura. So to kind of take us a step back, I like to think that, we have to take a step way, way back oftentimes if we're talking about photo history, because photography's been around for a while for most of us, but it's recent compared to a lot of different visual arts. And there's a couple really particular things about it that are fascinating. And I think the biggest thing is that photography, when it came about, a lot of times we have this myth, right, of the lone inventor, the genius in a studio, working tirelessly to have this breakthrough, right, this light bulb moment. And oftentimes photography is spoken of that way, especially in the early years. But I think what's really important to remember is that photography, I like to say, had a lot messier origins. People were already for centuries realizing that a darkened room with a small aperture can actually focus light inside and project it against a wall. There was lots of advances in optics, which led to the invention of things like lenses. And then also even, I love this camera as an example. This is an old view camera, an old field camera that takes a 5x7 format negative. And you can see the craftsmanship, right? The craft that went into it. So even think about how things like cabinet making and woodworking, all of these things come together around this time where we have this sharing of ideas, right, throughout across greater areas, and kind of pulling together all of these things. And really, the key moment for photography was, how do we take all these things like optics, like light-tight boxes, the ability and the knowledge that we can project an image, focus it using optics. How do we make an image of that projection and make it last, right? Make it permanent, fix it, if you will, has been a term that's been used. And that's really the start of photography, right? Is that these playing around with different chemicals coated on surfaces. We're more familiar with film nowadays, and even nowadays it's digital sensors. But really what it was is that ability to use chemistry to fix that image that was always fleeting, right? It was always ephemeral. And that's really the origins of photography. And I think that's really beautiful because we have artists who are still living and working today, stepping all the way back, right? Looking backward and looking at those origins, but also playing around with it, right? Sort of exploring, what I like to say, sort of pushing at the edges. And that's what I'm going to share with you today, is some more of those artists. So this image that you can see on screen takes us a little bit to the scientific principles behind camera obscuras, pinhole photography, and even any cameras that we have laying around, right? Whether it's our smartphone, which has a lens that focuses onto a digital sensor, or whether it's your favorite DSLR, which uses a fancier lens to focus onto a digital sensor and to record it and to show it on a screen. And you can see here in the diagram that we have this candle, right, on the outside of this box, this light-tight box. Then we have a small opening, right, aperture, which comes from the Latin root for opening, right? Aperture, apertura. And then you can see how the light traveling inward is then refocused against the wall in this darkened space to show us an image, but the image is upside down and reverse. And that's really just the physical principles behind reflected light. Light, if you think about it, when it's bouncing off things, travels in a straight line unless it's interrupted. So anything that's bouncing off, any light that is reflected off, say, the floor, is going to keep traveling. And if we were able to see it refocused, it'll actually be closer to the ceiling. And vice versa, right? The treetops, the power lines outside, any of those things, if I suddenly set up the ability to turn this room into a camera obscura, which I wish I could do for you today, but I don't think any of you could actually see me because the light levels would be so low. If we were to do that, we would see the power lines and the trees. Those would be reflected on the floor. So it's this really magical experience to be able to see something like that, because that's also how our eyes work. It just so happens that our eyes are super sophisticated and connected to our even more sophisticated brain, and what we do is our brain flips that image so that we're grounded and we can see the world right side up. So it's really fascinating because, again, this speaks to those really basic principles. So for our first artist, again, as I mentioned, there's lots of different opportunities to use either a camera obscura or, again, its smaller relative, the pinhole camera, because essentially what it is just a light, tight container, box, or even room with an aperture, right? An opening. Now, some camera obscuras are fancier and they have a lens to help focus the light or amplify the light. But pinhole cameras are a great example because those, again, are literally just a pinhole, right? But just having that much of an opening allows the light to, again, be refocused against the far side of the camera. And that takes us to our first artist that I wanted us to chat about today and to take a look at. And this artist's name, her name is Ruth Thorne-Thompson. And we have quite a few images of hers in our collection. And the first thing you might be thinking is, well, that doesn't exactly look like a pinhole photograph. A lot of times, if any of you have taken a photo course before or even just played around with pinhole cameras, we typically set it somewhere where we can open the flap or we can expose it, the image, and we have to sort of set it somewhere because exposure times are minutes usually, right? Because with a really small opening, that's very little light, which means we'll get a sharp image, but it means a really long exposure time. So Ruth Thorne-Thompson used these small pinhole cameras to create scenes like this, but you'll probably notice a couple things that are a little off about it. It's not exactly like she popped outside and just set up her pinhole camera to record what was there. We have this large statue head, right, laying on its side. And then we have, if we'll notice, a ladder, right? And that ladder is climbing up the head. And then we even have this view of a group of people sort of off on the crest of the hill, right? And there's off in the distance, and it really plays with our sense of scale. And that's the really magical thing about something as simple as a pinhole camera. What Ruth did is take small objects, cutouts, little figurines, miniatures, but the magic happened is when she trained her pinhole camera on it and then created this image, we suddenly have this forced perspective, right? This play of scale. So what was actually a really close-up scene of very small things suddenly became this large view, right? And it almost feels surrealistic, right? She was really inspired by some of the early travel photography and some of those views where, especially in Western Europe, photographers were taking these large view cameras and these large on these expeditions to go out and photograph around the world. And what's really wonderful about what Ruth did is that she didn't have to go much farther than outside, right? Or along the shoreline. She created these images in a few different locations across the US. But again, what I think is really wonderful is that she was able to play with sort of everyday objects around her or things that she collected. And again, using a camera that was about this big to create these scenes that play with our sense of scale and perspective and perception and seem like these large sort of surreal scenes. It's really a wonderful example of an artist using pinhole photography in creative ways. So when a lot of you saw our description here this morning that it was about camera obscura and pinhole photography, I hope one photographer did come to mind, and that photographer is the photographer Abelardo Morell. And Abelardo Morell creates work in rooms, so really living up, right, to that idea of a camera obscura, so converting an entire room. And what's really magical about his work is that it's often in conversation with what is outside that room. And we all have views from where we are. A lot of us are at home, probably looking at the same view out the window every day. And what's really wonderful about this example, we have a few of his works in the collection at the museum, is this one also, in keeping with that spirit of photography and the history of photography, takes us way back to some of the origins of photography. So some of you might recognize what this view is. This is actually a camera obscura photograph where he converted a room that overlooks Langcock Abbey. And Langcock Abbey was the location where Henry Fox Talbot, a really early experimenter with photochemistry, and his inventions led to the negative positive process, which gave us film and things like being able to copy photographs. This is the location where he did that early work. So in a way, Abelardo Morell is using a room which he converted into a camera obscura to speak at those fundamental principles of photography and take us back to sort of it in its simplest form. And then he chose a location that also speaks to the history of photography, which is this location where the development of photosensitive chemistry happened, and lots of different experiments that led to photography as we know it today, which is really exciting. For another artist, I wanted us to take a look at someone a little closer to home here in San Diego, and that artist's name is Susan Bernstein. And Susan Bernstein creates these wonderful, she uses a pinhole camera, so we're kind of bouncing back and forth between artists that use camera obscuras, so essentially room-sized cameras that they can get within. And then we also have artists who are using pinholes, right? These small cameras. But Susan Bernstein creates these images, often using parts from toy cameras. I'm pointing over my shoulder here because I've got, it's not quite a toy camera, but it's close. These smaller cameras. And what they have is they have these lenses, oftentimes plastic parts, and they have all these bits and pieces that you can kind of, what I like to say, Frankenstein together, right? You can kind of pull all these parts and create a camera of your own. And Susan Bernstein does that in order to explore her dreams. So she's really interested in taking photographs and making photographs that have a particular quality, but also explore the meaning and the nature of her dreams. And that, I think, also speaks to the power of photography, right? Because we can all use photography to capture the world around us. Lots of us take photographs at events to remember the people there, group photos. We take photographs on vacation to remember a place that we've been. But photography can also be really interpretive, right? It can be an opportunity for us to really have our hand in how the image looks, and how the image looks informs how we all interpret it, which is a really critical part about photography. So you can see this image, and let me go ahead and actually full screen this for everyone. And this image, some of you who are tuning in from Southern California will probably recognize this scene. This is a view in the Hollywood Hills, overlooking Griffith Observatory and downtown LA. So downtown LA are those skyscrapers that are rising off in the distance. And then we have Griffith Observatory sort of in the middle ground there, that white structure with the dark dome. But you can see the quality of the pinhole photograph by using a pinhole camera. It has a dreamlike quality in and of itself. It creates these wonderful vignettes around the edges. The focus is sharpest right at the center, a bit like our vision, and not just like our everyday vision, also like our memory of our vision in dreams. So Susan Bernstein is really using this in such a creative way to take all of us into perhaps an experience that she had, right? A view or a vision that she had in one of her dreams as well. And I think that's always such a really cool use of photography. So one other example that I wanted to use today for us to take a look at would be the artist Chiara, which is also speaking to us and our location here in California. Chiara is located in the Bay Area, works in the Bay Area, or has worked between New York and California, and he, to bounce back again to camera obscura, creates these large images with color photographic paper that he can physically get inside, right? The camera obscura, the camera itself. And so for those of you who are familiar with editing your photographs, and you can think about burning and dodging, or, adjusting certain areas of the photograph, when I think about John's work, it's like, if you could shrink yourself down and you could burn and dodge and edit the photograph while the photograph is actually being taken. And that's, I think, a really cool thing, right? We typically think, okay, we'll take the photograph, then we'll get it on our computer, or take it into the darkroom, and then we'll do our editing. And John's work really has us sort of shrink down in his process, think about what would it be like if we could get inside the camera and actually get our hands between, right, the light that's passing between the opening and the actual photosensitive material. And he creates these works which are just absolutely beautiful because it's color photographic paper. We're suddenly in the world of color, and we have this scene with this beautiful golden light. This image is called Coral End, and you can again see sort of the qualities of the camera obscura and how it's very different a lot of times than the camera technology that we're used to nowadays, because we can even see how he cut the photographic paper. That wasn't a mistake on the editing. That's actually literally where he would cut slices, right, of this large photographic color paper and then tape it up within the camera obscura so that it could record the image that the camera obscura was looking at. So another really cool example from MOPA's collection of artists using this kind of technology in really creative ways, really, really interesting ways. So that kind of brings us all the way up through Shi Guorui. And Shi Guorui is a contemporary artist living and working in China, and he has two works on view right now as part of MOPA's exhibition, Out of the Shadows, Contemporary Chinese Photography. And as I mentioned, these images are literally mural size. So most of us are used to photographs that are 4x6, 5x7, and I always like to point out that most of us are actually not even used to a physical photograph anymore, right? We're used to literally most of our photos living on our phones. But Shi Guorui takes us to the other end of the spectrum, where he again creates these large camera obscuras with massive black and white photographic paper that's taped up inside to capture these views, these landscapes. And his first image was actually in one of the watchtowers along the Great Wall of China, that he was able to convert into a camera obscura. And that's such a magical thing because, as I mentioned earlier in the program, the technology or the understanding of a camera obscura had been around for centuries before photography as we know it was invented or came about. And so for Shi Guorui, for him, it was an ability to meditate on the photographic process, but also to connect to a famous Chinese scholar, mathematician, and inventor named Mozi. And Mozi lived in, I believe, the 400s BC in China. So we're going back over 2,000 years. And Mozi did some experimentations with the camera obscura and realized that you could have a darkened room or space. I believe he called them a treasure room. In which you could then have a small opening, and whatever was outside would be projected in this wonderful sort of beautiful way against the wall, the far wall of the room. And so we have Shi Guorui kind of looking back at photographic history, but then looking back even further for inspiration, and then bringing us all the way up through modern day in the kinds of scenes that he's focusing on. So we have this scene here, which is called New CCTV, kind of a reference to closed circuit television, right? These video cameras and these traffic cameras that are in so many of our cities nowadays. But instead of it being a grainy, sort of small digital footage, we have him creating these large camera obscura images. And we can see here the booming building, right? Of a city in China. We can see the skyscrapers going up. We can see the crane there in the upper left-hand corner. And it's really beautiful because we have this kind of wonderfully sort of textured and geometric scene, and of course because everything's in reverse, because he used photographic paper, whatever is brightest will look darkest in the final image, and vice versa, because it's a direct process. We also have this scene that kind of invites all of us to look at it a little bit closer and meditate on it a little bit more. And I have one more of his images as well here, which we can take a look at. And this one is looking a bit more at that landscape tradition, a bit more traditional landscape tradition. And this is along the Yangtze River, so critical and important river in commerce, in tradition, and in culture in China. And again, we have that invert, right? That inversion of tonality. We have the mountain, which would feel sort of dark and heavy. We have this bright pop, right? And the river becomes almost mirror-like. And of course, the sky behind it is completely blocked out. And what's important to note too is that these images, even though he was making these images over the past 10 years with these large camera obscuras and modern photographic paper, the exposure time was still really, really slow. So like the view we saw before, and also like this view that we can see now, we typically don't see people, we don't see frozen motion, we don't see a lot of hustle and bustle, because the longer an exposure is, anything that's moving just won't be captured by the photograph. That's why some of the earliest photographs that we have, especially that came about or were created in Europe, in France, and in England, they didn't feature people, especially those huge scenes or those large sweeping scenes of cities. We can think of Paris in the 1800s, of London, some of those street scenes. They actually would have been bustling when the photographer had the camera set up and was making the exposure. But if the exposure took 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, anyone who was sort of quickly walking through the scene wouldn't have been recorded at all. So what we have is instead is a scene that actually looks quite deserted. It looks quite empty. Like a lot of our cities, actually, recently. I'm sure a lot of you have been tuning in and checking out a lot of the really cool work the photographers are making, looking at what our cities look like during this time of isolation and social distancing, right? We have places like downtown San Diego in LA, or even Manhattan in New York, which are completely empty. So kind of taking us back a little bit there in photographic history. So again, this is such a great opportunity for us to take a look at works by artists like Shi Guorui, who are at MOPA right now in our current exhibition, but then look at the broad idea, right? Look at that big concept behind the work, and then look at how other artists have explored that across photographic history. And for today, I wanted to go ahead and take you through a short little example. I want to invite everybody at home, if you've got some time today and the right kind of materials, you can turn any room that you have into a camera obscura. You would block out the windows, so it typically works best with a room that has maybe just one window in it, and then directly across from the window, a good wall to see the image projected. And then you can use anything from tin foil to really heavy cloth or sheets, anything that really blocks out the light. Even cardboard that's cut to the size of the window and taped in, that'll work just great. And then in the very middle of where you have that light blocked out, you'll go ahead and put a pinhole, and you might want to play around with the size of the pinhole, but at least you'll be able to, once your eyes dark adjust, you'll start seeing the view from outside projected inside. And for us just to take a look real quick here at a live example of a camera obscura, I've got my nifty smartphone here that is actually showing us the view from my phone. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is, as I mentioned, this camera behind me is a field camera, so it's not a camera obscura or a pinhole, but it's just before the time where we had roll film, and it's certainly before the time where we have digital sensors now. So what it lets us do is it lets us actually see what the view is like or would be like in a camera obscura or even a pinhole camera. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to take my camera over here. You can actually see the studio where I'm coming to you live. And I'm going to go behind this cloth, and you all in just a moment will be able to see. And now what we're looking at is we're actually looking at the back of the camera. So we're seeing the view that the camera is looking at through the lens, and it's projected against what's called ground glass. And that ground glass is just essentially glass that's been polished on one side so it catches enough of the light and the light doesn't just pass straight through it. And what that allows us to do, it allows us to see the scene, and this would allow the photographer to focus and to fine-tune the composition before putting that either glass negative or sheet film in there to go ahead and actually take the photograph. But what's really magical about this is, for me, it never gets old, this kind of view. It's a really magical experience, again, to see the scene outside reflected upside down in reverse on the inside of something. And so you're actually seeing the view of the gate outside. You can see the palm trees are towards the bottom of the image. Again, those basic principles, right, that we were talking about how light is transmitted. So I want to go ahead and thank everyone today for tuning in, and I hope you can join us next week for our next MOPA in Focus. And in the meantime, make sure you go ahead over to MOPA.org to check out all those different resources I was talking about, everything from online exhibitions, educational content and resources, as well as news and information about the museum. So I want to thank all of you for tuning in today, and I can't wait to see you next week on Friday at 10 a.m. for another MOPA in Focus.